Imagine waking up to explosions, missiles striking cities, families fleeing with nothing but a suitcase. This isn't a movie. This is Europe in the 21st century, the largest war on the continent since World War II. And the world is still holding its breath. On February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For many, it felt impossible. Could this really happen in modern Europe? But it did. Tanks rolled across borders. Missiles lit up the night skies of Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. The world changed in a single day. This war isn't just about land. It's about freedom versus oppression, democracy versus dictatorship, and the echoes of this conflict will shape the future for decades. Today, we'll walk through the story of the Russia-Ukraine war, how it began, the turning points, the tragedies, and the resilience of a nation fighting for survival. Main story, chronological retelling. To understand this war, we must look back. Ukraine, once part of the Soviet Union, gained independence in 1991. But Russia never truly let go. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, a shocking move that broke international law. At the same time, Moscow fueled a war in eastern Ukraine, arming separatists in Donbass. For 8 years, the conflict simmered, but in early 2022, Russia took it to the next level. Vladimir Putin believed Ukraine belonged to Russia, that it had no right to exist as a sovereign state, and he decided to erase it by force. February 24th, 2022. Explosions across Ukraine. Columns of Russian tanks moved in from 3 sides, from the north, the east, and the south. The plan? Capture Kyiv in 3 days. Replace the government. Install a puppet regime. But something unexpected happened. Ukraine fought back. Ordinary people picked up rifles, Molotov cocktails, anything they could find. President Volodymyr Zelensky refused to flee, declaring, "I need ammunition, not a ride." The world watched as a small nation stood up to a superpower. The early weeks saw chaos and destruction. In Bucha, just outside Kyiv, Russian forces left behind horrific evidence. Mass graves, civilians executed in the streets. Images of atrocities shocked the world. But then came a turning point. Russia failed to capture Kyiv. Ukrainian forces pushed them back. Attention shifted east and south. In Mariupol, a once thriving city by the sea, residents endured months of siege, no water, no power. The world watched the Azovstal steel plant become a last stand of Ukrainian defenders. At the same time, HIMARS rocket systems and Western weapons began arriving in Ukraine. Suddenly, the playing field wasn't so uneven. In September 2022, Ukraine launched a stunning counteroffensive in Kharkiv, liberating thousands of square miles in days. The world saw that Ukraine could win. This war was never just local. Energy prices spiked. Food shortages spread across the world as Ukraine's grain exports were blocked. Millions of refugees fled to Europe and beyond, and for Americans, this war echoed familiar fears. Nuclear threats. A new Cold War. Democracy under attack. The climax of this story is not a single battle, but the ongoing fight for survival. Every day, Ukraine faces drone strikes, blackouts, missile barrages. Every day, soldiers defend trenches reminiscent of World War I. And yet, Ukraine is still standing. What Russia thought would last 3 days has dragged into years. What Putin saw as weakness became resilience. And the war is far from over. So where are we now? Ukraine continues to fight, backed by Western support, weapons, and aid. Russia digs in, hoping time is on its side. But this conflict isn't just about borders. It's about the future of the international order. If aggression goes unpunished here, where does it stop? For Americans, the echoes are clear. This is not just Ukraine's war. It's a test of whether freedom and democracy can endure in the face of tyranny. The war in Ukraine is still being written. Every day adds a new chapter, and history will judge how the world responded. So, let me ask you, what do you think? Can Ukraine win this war? And could something like this ever happen again in our lifetime? The collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. For the first time in centuries, Ukraine stood as an independent nation. This wasn't just paperwork. For Moscow, it was a wound, a humiliation. Vladimir Putin would later call the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. For Ukraine, it was a dream. Independence meant building a new future, a democracy, a free economy, and a life closer to Europe than to Russia. But the divorce was messy, Ukraine's identity crisis. Ukraine has always been at a crossroads, East and West, Europe and Russia. Some regions, especially in the West, leaned toward Europe. Others, closer to Russia, kept deep cultural, linguistic, and economic ties with Moscow. This division would shape politics for decades. Elections often split the country. One president leaned toward Russia, the next leaned toward Europe, and each choice created new conflict, the Orange Revolution, 2004. In 2004, Ukraine faced a pivotal moment. The presidential election was rigged. The Kremlin's favorite, Viktor Yanukovych, was declared the winner. But millions of Ukrainians refused to accept it. They poured into the streets of Kyiv wearing orange, the color of the opposition. For weeks, they protested peacefully in freezing temperatures, and they won. The election was rerun, and the pro-European candidate Viktor Yushchenko became president. For the West, this was democracy in action. For Moscow, it was a disaster. Ukraine was slipping away between Russia and the West. The next decade was a tug of war. Ukraine depended on Russia for gas, trade, and energy, but it also wanted closer ties with NATO and the European Union. The West encouraged reforms. Moscow used pressure, blackmail, and bribes. Ukraine tried to balance both sides. But balance was impossible, the Revolution of Dignity, 2013 to 2014. By 2013, the people of Ukraine were ready for change. They demanded closer integration with Europe. An agreement with the European Union was on the table. But at the last moment, President Yanukovych, the same man who had been Moscow's favorite years before, rejected it. Instead, he turned back to Russia. The reaction was explosive. Students and young people filled Kyiv's central square, the Maidan waving European flags. They wanted a different future, a European future. What began as a peaceful protest turned bloody. Riot police cracked down, people were beaten, then shot. But the protesters didn't leave. They built barricades, they lit fires, they stood for months. And finally, they won. Yanukovych fled the country. This was more than a political victory. Ukrainians called it the Revolution of Dignity. They had chosen Europe, Putin strikes back. Crimea, 2014. For Russia, this was unacceptable. Putin saw Ukraine slipping permanently out of Moscow's orbit. So in 2014, Russian soldiers, little green men without insignia, appeared in Crimea. Within weeks, Russia annexed the peninsula. It was the first time since World War II that European borders were changed by force. The world was shocked. Sanctions followed. But Russia didn't stop war in Donbass, 2014 to 2021. At the same time, Russia fueled a war in eastern Ukraine. It armed and funded separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. For years, fighting raged. Cities were destroyed. Thousands died. It wasn't full-scale war, but it was a wound that never healed, and it kept Ukraine unstable, weakened, divided NATO, the EU, and the fear in Moscow. As Ukraine leaned more toward the West, Putin grew more paranoid. NATO wasn't planning to invade Russia. But for Putin, the idea of Ukraine joining NATO was intolerable. He saw it as a threat not just to Russia's security, but to his power. Because if Ukraine could succeed as a democratic, Western-facing nation, why couldn't Russia? The stage is set, 2019 to 2021. By 2019, Ukraine had a new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, a comedian turned politician. Many doubted him at first, but he promised change. In Moscow, Putin was preparing a Russian state TV raged against Ukraine, calling it Nazi, corrupt, illegitimate. Troops gathered near the border. The West warned of an invasion, but many didn't believe it would happen. Not in the 21st century, not in Europe. They were wrong. Conclusion of Part 1, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Orange Revolution. The Revolution of Dignity, Crimea. Donbass. Each chapter brought Ukraine closer to the West and deeper into conflict with Russia. By early 2022, the stage was set. What began as protests for freedom would explode into the largest war in Europe since World War II. The invasion, February-April 2022. Hook. The day the world changed, February 24th, 2022. A date now written into history. At 4 a.m., Ukraine awoke to the sound of explosions. Russian missiles struck airports, cities, and military bases. Columns of tanks rolled across the borders. It was the beginning of the largest invasion in Europe since World War. The plan: 3 days to Kyiv. Russia believed the war would be fast. Their generals told Putin, Ukraine will fall in 3 days. They expected little resistance. The plan was simple. Strike Ukraine's air defenses, capture airports near Kyiv, send tanks to encircle the capital. Kill or capture President Volodymyr Zelensky, install a pro-Russian puppet government. But this plan underestimated one thing: the will of the Ukrainian people. The first hours, February 24. Missiles rained down on Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa. Explosions lit up the night sky. Millions of Ukrainians grabbed whatever they could and fled west. But instead of collapsing, the country mobilized. Traffic jams stretched for miles out of Kyiv, families desperate to escape. At the same time, young men lined up at recruiting centers. Ordinary civilians, teachers, IT workers, farmers, volunteered to fight. Zelensky refused evacuation, declaring, "I need ammunition, not a ride." His words became a rallying cry battle for Hostomel Airport. One of Russia's key moves was the assault on Hostomel Airport. Just outside Kyiv, elite paratroopers landed by helicopter, aiming to secure a landing zone for Russian reinforcements. But Ukrainian forces fought back fiercely. Within hours, the airport became a battlefield. Russian helicopters were shot down, paratroopers trapped. This single battle delayed Russia's advance and may have saved Kyiv chaos in the north. As Russian columns moved toward Kyiv, something unexpected happened. They stalled. Long convoys stretched for miles, stuck on narrow roads. Ukrainian drones and artillery struck supply trucks. Locals sabotaged bridges and fed intelligence to the army. The 3-day plan was already failing life in Kyiv. Inside Kyiv, life turned into survival. Families hid in subway stations turned into bomb shelters. Children slept on cold floors. Volunteers handed out food and blankets, and yet the spirit of resistance grew. Artists sang in shelters, priests prayed in bunkers. Even as air raid sirens wailed, people stood together. Bucha and Irpin, the horror revealed. As Russian troops occupied suburbs around Kyiv, Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, they left behind scenes of horror. When Ukraine liberated these towns weeks later, the truth was revealed. Bodies of civilians lay in the streets. Mass graves were uncovered. Survivors told of torture, executions, rape. The world was horrified. Bucha became a symbol, not of battle, but of atrocity, the siege of Mariupol. While Kyiv held, the south faced devastation. Mariupol, a city of 400,000, was surrounded. Russian forces bombed apartment blocks, hospitals, Even a theater marked children in giant letters. Electricity failed. Water ran out. People melted snow to drink. Mass graves appeared in courtyards. The Azovstal steel plant became the final fortress. For weeks, outnumbered Ukrainian defenders held out underground, in tunnels and bunkers. Their resistance became legendary Kharkiv under fire. In the northeast, Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, came under constant shelling. Russian rockets struck residential areas daily, yet the city never surrendered. Universities turned into shelters. Volunteers distributed bread under bombardment. Kharkiv stood, scarred but unbroken. He world responds. The invasion shocked the world. Within days, millions of refugees fled to Poland, Romania, Germany. Western governments responded with unprecedented sanctions. Russian banks were cut off. Oligarchs lost yachts and mansions. The ruble collapsed, temporarily. Most importantly, weapons began to flow into Ukraine. At first, rifles and helmets, then anti-tank missiles like the American Javelin. Soon, Ukraine would receive HIMARS rocket systems and air defense Zelensky, a wartime leader. Volodymyr Zelensky, once a comedian, became the face of resistance. He addressed parliaments around the world via video calls, always in his olive green t-shirt, unshaven, tired, but defiant. He quoted Churchill to the British, Martin Luther King Jr. to Americans. He reminded the world, this is not just our war, it is your war too. Russia's failures. By April 2022, it was clear Russia's initial invasion had failed. They had not taken Kyiv. They had not broken Ukraine. Instead, they had suffered heavy losses. Abandoned tanks littered roads. Morale among Russian soldiers plummeted. Western intelligence estimated tens of thousands of casualties. Russia retreated from northern Ukraine, but they were far from finished. The war shifts east. After withdrawing from Kyiv, Russia focused on the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. There, the war became slower, bloodier. Artillery duels, trenches, village by village fighting. The dream of a quick victory was gone. Now the war would be long. End of part 2. The world expected Ukraine to collapse in days. Instead, Ukraine survived. It resisted. Kyiv stood. Kharkiv endured. Mariupol became a symbol, and Zelensky rose as a wartime leader. But this was only the beginning. As spring 2022 turned to summer, the war entered a new, more brutal phase. The battle for Ukraine, and for the future of Europe, was just beginning. Hook, the turning tide. In the summer of 2022, something remarkable happened. The world expected Ukraine to survive, but few believed it could win. And yet, as months passed, a new reality emerged. Russia was not unstoppable. Its army could be beaten, and Ukraine was about to prove its stalemate in the Donbass. After retreating from Kyiv, Russia poured its forces into eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. For months, battles raged around cities like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Villages changed hands daily. Artillery thundered day and night. The fighting looked like scenes from World War I. Trenches, mud, endless shelling. Russia advanced slowly, destroying everything in its path. By July, Russia declared victory in Luhansk province. But the cost was staggering. Entire towns were rubble, thousands of soldiers dead. And while Russia celebrated, Ukraine was preparing Western weapons arrive. In June, the United States delivered a game-changer, HIMARS rocket systems. These mobile launchers could fire with pinpoint accuracy from 50 miles away. Suddenly, Ukrainian forces could strike Russian supply lines, ammunition depots, and command posts far behind the front. Russian soldiers began to fear the night skies. Every explosion deep in their territory signaled a new reality. Nowhere was safe. The flow of Western weapons accelerated. Drones, artillery, radar systems. What began as a fight for survival was turning into a fight for victory, the battle for Kharkiv. By late summer, Ukraine prepared a bold move. Russian forces had overextended. Their supply lines were weak. Their morale was crumbling. In September, Ukraine launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. What happened next shocked the world. Ukrainian forces swept through Russian lines at lightning speed. Within days, they liberated thousands of square miles. Towns that had lived under Russian occupation for months suddenly flew Ukrainian flags again. Russian troops abandoned tanks, weapons, even uniforms as they fled. The once feared Russian army looked broken liberation and horror. As towns and villages were liberated, another truth emerged. Occupation left scars. Stories poured out from survivors. Torture, executions, forced deportations. Mass graves were uncovered in Izium. Liberation was joyful, but it was also a reminder of what was at stake: Kherson. The first major city falls. At the same time, in the south, Ukraine targeted Kherson, the only regional capital Russia had captured. For months, Ukrainian artillery and HIMARS pounded Russian positions, cutting supply routes across the Dnipro River. Bridges collapsed. Depots exploded. Russian troops were trapped on the western bank. In November, the moment came. Russia withdrew. Kherson was free. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, hugging soldiers. For Ukraine, it was proof. They could not only survive, they could win. The Kremlin reacts. The defeats humiliated Moscow. In September, Putin announced partial mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of Russian men were drafted. Many fled the country instead, to Georgia, Kazakhstan, even Mongolia. Putin also staged referendums in occupied territories. Sham votes to claim Ukraine's land as forever Russia. But on the battlefield, nothing was forever. The energy war. As Ukraine advanced, Russia struck back another way, by targeting energy. Missiles and drones hit power plants, transformers, dams. By winter, millions of Ukrainians lived without electricity or heat. Entire cities sat in darkness. It was a cruel tactic, not just to defeat Ukraine's army, but to break its spirit. But instead of surrender, Ukrainians adapted. They lit candles, they shared generators. They endured Zelensky in Washington. In December 2022, Zelensky made a dramatic visit to Washington, D.C., his first trip abroad since the war began. Standing in the U.S. Congress, dressed in his olive green sweatshirt, he thanked Americans for their support. He compared Ukraine's fight to America's own revolution. His message was clear: we need you, and we will win. The turning point. By the end of 2022, the war had transformed. Russia's dream of conquering Kyiv was dead. Ukraine had liberated Kharkiv and Kherson. The West was more united than ever. But the cost was enormous: tens of thousands dead. Cities in ruins, millions displaced. The war was far from over. But for the first time, the world believed Ukraine could win. The summer and fall of 2022 were a turning point. Ukraine proved its strength. Russia showed its weakness. But victory was not yet secure. As winter approached, both armies dug in. The next battles, and in Bakhmut, in the skies, and the world's economies, would test the endurance of nations. The war was entering a new phase hook, the frozen front. Winter in Ukraine. Temperatures below zero. Snow covering trenches filled with mud and blood. For soldiers, survival was not just about bullets and shells. It was about warmth, food, and hope. And in these months, the war entered one of its darkest, bloodiest phases, the battle for Bakhmut. The small city of Bakhmut, once home to 70,000 people, became the center of the world's attention. Why? It wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. For Russia, capturing Bakhmut meant proving they could still advance. For Ukraine, defending it meant proving Russia could still be stopped. The battle raged for months, street by street, building by building. Artillery fire turned the city into ruins, and leading the assault was not the regular Russian army, but the Wagner Group, Wagner, Putin's shadow army. The Wagner Group, a private mercenary force led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, took the spotlight. Thousands of convicts were recruited from Russian prisons, offered freedom in exchange for 6 months at the front. Wagner used brutal tactics, human wave assaults, throwing men at Ukrainian lines until defenses cracked. The losses were horrific, but slowly Russia pushed forward. By May 2023, Bakhmut would fall, but its ruins would cost Russia tens of thousands of lives. The drones arrive. As winter deepened, a new weapon dominated the skies: drones. Russia began using Iranian-made Shahed drones, slow, cheap, but deadly. They swarmed over Ukrainian cities, striking power plants, warehouses, even apartment blocks. Ukraine responded with its own drone innovations: DIY drones, long-range strikes, creative tactics. For the first time, the battlefield was filled not just with tanks and artillery, but buzzing machines carrying explosives. This was a new kind of warfare, one that would shape the future: the energy blackout. Russia's campaign against Ukraine's energy grid intensified. Missiles targeted power stations, leaving millions in darkness. In Kyiv, entire neighborhoods went without heat in sub-zero temperatures. Hospitals relied on generators. Schools moved underground. But the blackout strategy backfired. Instead of breaking Ukraine's spirit, it hardened it. The phrase, "we will endure," became a mantra. Candles lit kitchens. Subway stations turned into classrooms. The world watched in awe as Ukrainians adapted, refusing to break nuclear blackmail. As Russia suffered setbacks, Putin escalated his rhetoric. He threatened the use of nuclear weapons. State television hosts spoke casually about striking London, Berlin, even Washington. The world held its breath. Would Russia cross the unthinkable line? But NATO made it clear: any nuclear use would bring catastrophic consequences. The threats remained threats, but the shadow of nuclear war returned for the first time since the Cold War, the Grain War. Another battleground was food. Ukraine is one of the world's largest grain exporters. Russia's blockade of Black Sea ports threatened famine in Africa and the Middle East. Through UN and Turkish mediation, a fragile grain deal was struck. Ships carried wheat and corn out of Odessa, feeding millions. But every shipment was tense. Would Russia honor the deal, or would hunger become another weapon of war Western unity tested? As the war dragged on, questions grew louder in the West. How long could aid continue? How much money? How many weapons? How much patience? But visits by leaders like U.S. President Joe Biden, who walked the streets of Kyiv in February 2023, sent a clear signal. The West was not abandoning Ukraine. For Ukrainians, it was both symbolic and practical. Reassurance that they were not alone. Human stories. Survival in winter. Beyond the battlefields, winter meant daily struggle. Families cooked meals on open fires in courtyards. Children studied by flashlight. Elderly women wrapped themselves in blankets, refusing to leave their homes even as shells fell nearby. These stories reminded the world the war wasn't just tanks and missiles. It was human endurance. The cost of war. By spring 2023, estimates of Russian losses were staggering. More than 100,000 killed or wounded. Ukraine, too, suffered devastating casualties. Entire towns emptied of men of fighting age. Cemeteries filled with fresh graves. This was no longer a short war. It was a war of attrition. A test of which side could endure longer. Winter 2022. Spring 2023 was not about rapid movements or dramatic victories. It was about survival. about endurance, about proving that Ukraine could not be broken no matter the cost. As the snow melted and spring arrived, attention turned once again to the battlefield. Whispers grew louder. Ukraine was preparing something big. Summer 2023. The snow had melted, the fields were green again, and the world was waiting. For months, Ukraine had promised a counteroffensive. Western tanks had arrived. New brigades were trained. Billions of dollars in aid had poured in. This was supposed to be the moment, the great push that could turn the war once and for all. Would Ukraine break the Russian lines, or would the war grind into another bloody stalemate? Western weapons, a new arsenal. By June, Ukraine had something it never had before: Leopard tanks from Germany, Challengers from Britain, Bradley fighting vehicles from the United States. They were sleek, modern, deadly. Ukrainian soldiers trained for months in NATO countries, learning Western tactics. The hope was clear: a breakthrough that would shatter Russian defenses and liberate occupied territory in the south. But the battlefield had other plans: Russia's Surovikin line. As Ukraine prepared, Russia dug in. For months, Russian engineers built what became known as the Surovikin line, a vast system of trenches, concrete bunkers, tank traps, and minefields stretching across hundreds of miles. Some minefields were 5, even 10 miles deep. Behind them stood artillery, drones, and reserves. It was the most fortified battlefield Europe had seen in generations. Breaking through would be harder than anyone expected. The first attacks. In early June, Ukraine launched its assault in the Zaporizhzhia region. Columns of Western armor rolled forward, but within minutes they hit minefields. Drones spotted them, artillery struck, images of destroyed Leopards and Bradleys spread online. Critics declared the offensive a failure. But the truth was more complicated. Ukraine adapted. Instead of large armored pushes, they switched to smaller, infantry-led assaults, moving carefully, yard by yard, field by field. Progress was slow, painfully slow, but it was steady: the Battle of Robotine. One name came to symbolize the summer offensive: Robotine, a small village on the road to Melitopol. For weeks, Ukraine fought through minefields, trenches, and bunkers. By late August, the Ukrainian flag flew over Robotine. It was a small place, but a big victory. Proof that Russia's lines could be broken. Drones everywhere. If the summer of 2022 belonged to HIMARS, the summer of 2023 belonged to drones. Both sides filled the skies with them, from cheap quadcopters bought online to advanced kamikaze drones. Soldiers called the battlefield a drone hell. No movement went unseen. Every tank, every truck, every soldier could be targeted within minutes. It was war in the open, war under constant surveillance. And it changed everything: the frustration of slow progress. By September, the world grew impatient. Commentators asked, why hasn't Ukraine broken through? Why are the gains so small? But anyone on the ground knew the answer. Every meter cost blood. Every trench was mined, wired, defended. The offensive wasn't glamorous. It was grinding, exhausting, relentless. And yet, village by village, Ukraine advanced. By fall, they had pushed deep into the first Russian defensive line, Russia on the defensive. For the first time since the war began, Russia had no major offensives of its own. Its army was on the back foot. Its air force failed to dominate. Its economy groaned under sanctions, but Russia was not collapsing. It still had men, weapons, and endless trenches. The war became a test of endurance. By late 2023, the counteroffensive had not achieved the grand breakthrough many hoped for. Melitopol was not liberated. Crimea remained in Russian hands, but Ukraine had proven something else. They could penetrate Russia's defenses. They could liberate land. They could force Russia onto the defensive. And in war, sometimes survival and steady progress are victories in themselves. Avdiivka, the new Bakhmut. As snow fell again, another name entered the world's headlines. Avdiivka. A small industrial town near Donetsk, it became the focus of Russia's winter offensive. Tens of thousands of Russian troops, backed by tanks, artillery, and waves of armored vehicles, attacked the city again and again. The scenes echoed Bakhmut: trenches, frozen fields, bodies left in the snow. Russia paid a staggering price, losing thousands of soldiers in a matter of weeks. But they kept coming. For Ukraine, Avdiivka was both a shield and a symbol. If it fell, Russia would tighten its grip on Donetsk. If it held, Ukraine would prove that Russia's human wave tactics were no match for resilience and strategy, mobilization on both sides. As the war dragged into its second winter, both sides faced a human problem: soldiers. Russia continued mobilizing. Young men were snatched from streets, drafted with little training and thrown to the front. Prisons once again became recruiting grounds. Ukraine, too, faced difficult debates. How to keep its brigades filled after nearly 2 years of brutal combat. Discussions about lowering the draft age, about rotating exhausted soldiers, sparked heated arguments across the country. It was a reminder. This war consumed not only weapons, but people. Russia's adaptation. Despite heavy losses, Russia adapted. Factories in Russia, often with Chinese help, increased production of artillery shells, drones, and tanks. Iran supplied more Shahed drones. North Korea shipped ammunition. What sanctions slowed, black markets supplied. Russia's war machine bent, but did not break. And on the battlefield, its tactics evolved. Drones guided artillery. Electronic warfare jammed Ukrainian systems. The Russian army that once blundered outside Kyiv was learning. Ukraine responded in kind. Its drone industry exploded. Long-range strikes hit targets deep inside Russia. Air bases, oil depots, even Moscow's financial district. For the first time, Russians felt the war inside their own borders. Kremlin propaganda called these attacks terrorism. But for Ukrainians, they were justice life in a war-torn winter. For civilians, winter was once again a season of blackouts, cold, and fear. Missile barrages returned. Every night, sirens wailed. Every morning, people checked to see which cities had been hit. Yet, life went on. Shops reopened. Schools held classes online or underground. Weddings, funerals, Christmas celebrations. All continued even under fire. It was resilience written into daily life, the war of narratives. By early 2024, the war was not only on the ground, it was in the narrative. Russia claimed it was winning, that Ukraine's counteroffensive had failed. Ukraine countered with proof of Russian losses, destroyed tanks, captured villages, and the world, it grew divided. Some nations stood firm with Ukraine, others, weary of high energy prices and refugee crises, urged negotiations. Whose story would prevail mattered almost as much as whose army would. By spring 2024, the front lines looked eerily familiar. Little had changed on the map, but beneath the surface the cost mounted. Hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Billions spent. A generation scarred. It was no longer a war of rapid movement. It was a war of exhaustion. The front lines hold, but the sky changes. On the ground, little moved. Trenches stretched across Ukraine like scars, towns reduced to rubble. The front line barely shifted, only a few kilometers here or there. But above the battlefield, a new war raged. Drones filled the skies. Ukraine launched swarms of FPV drones destroying tanks and convoys. Russia answered with Shaheds, trying to break Ukraine's energy grid again. The war of steel gave way to a war of circuits. The drone strikes inside Russia. For the first time, the Russian homeland felt vulnerable. Explosions ripped through oil refineries in Belgorod, Bryansk, and even deep into Tatarstan, hundreds of miles from the border. Videos of flaming oil tanks spread online. Ordinary Russians could no longer pretend the war was distant. Moscow blamed terrorist attacks. Ukraine said little, but the message was clear. If Russia could strike Kyiv, Ukraine could strike back political storms in Moscow. By early summer, cracks in Putin's facade grew. Rumors of discontent in the Kremlin. Generals replaced. Oligarchs whispering about sanctions strangling their empires. Ordinary Russians grew restless. Inflation bit into wallets. Thousands of funerals for soldiers piled up. And then came the shock. The mysterious deaths of several Russian officials. Car accidents, sudden illnesses, unexplained plane crashes, whispers of purges spread like wildfire. Was Putin tightening his grip or losing it? Kyiv's dilemma: how to fight on. In Ukraine, the challenge was no less severe. The counteroffensive of 2023 had not broken Russia's lines. Now, commanders debated, should they prepare for another massive push in the south? Or dig in, conserve strength, and wait for Western weapons to arrive? President Zelensky faced pressure on all sides. Soldiers demanded rotation and relief. Civilians wanted security. Allies wanted results. Every decision carried life and death weight. Russia's summer push. In June, Russia launched a new offensive north of Kharkiv. Columns of armor, backed by relentless artillery, rolled toward Ukrainian defenses. It was brutal, grinding, costly. Villages switched hands multiple times. Ukraine's defenders fought back with American HIMARS, German Leopards, and endless waves of drones. The battles looked like World War I with 21st century technology. Neither side could break the other. Civilian suffering continues. For Ukraine's people, summer 2024 brought no relief. Missile attacks targeted Odessa's ports, crippling grain exports. Farmers watched fields burn. Children grew up knowing only air raid sirens. Yet, there was resilience. Festivals still took place in safer regions. Couples still married, even in uniform. Ukraine's spirit refused to die. The global stage shifts. Far from the front, global politics shifted. China balanced carefully, selling technology to Russia while avoiding direct sanctions. Iran boasted about its drones, now infamous in Ukraine. NATO debated expansion, with Sweden and Finland changing the map of Europe's security. And in the global south, some nations began to openly question, why was the West united for Ukraine, but divided on wars elsewhere? The Ukraine conflict had become more than a regional fight. It was the world's mirror, reflecting every divide. By September 2024, the map looked almost unchanged from the start of the year. But beneath that surface, Russia had bled tens of thousands more soldiers. Ukraine had struck deeper inside Russia than ever before. Western unity hung by a thread. The war was no closer to ending. Instead, it felt like a test of patience, of endurance, of who would break first. The war between Ukraine and Russia is not just a story of battles. It is a story of people, of courage and fear, of sacrifice and hope. From Kyiv to Mariupol, from Bakhmut to Avdiivka, every city tells us the same truth. This war has changed the world, and yet the story is not over. New chapters are still being written, day by day, hour by hour. History is unfolding before our eyes. If you want to discover even more facts, more hidden moments, and more human stories from this war, leave a comment below. Your feedback will decide if we create a second part, with even deeper insights into this conflict that continues to shape our future. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and never forget, history is not the past, it is happening right now. Goodbye, and see you in the next documentary.